40. Harley-Davidsons were cutting through the gray Oregon cold when a barefoot 5-year-old appeared in the middle of the highway like a ghost that refused to stay dead. The child didn't scream. She didn't run. She simply collapsed onto the asphalt in front of the lead bike, and the entire column of iron and leather ground to a halt in a long, shuddering roar. Hammer Malone pulled off his helmet and crouched down in the middle of the road, and the little girl looked up at him with eyes that had already seen too much of the world's worst corners. She whispered 4 words that would pull 40 men into a darkness none of them had gone looking for. "They're killing my mom." If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where we want you. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story from this channel. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city, what country are you watching from right now? We want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that highway, to that child, and to the 40 men who are about to learn that some rides don't end where you planned them. The memorial ride happened every year on the 3rd Saturday of November, and it happened in silence. That was the rule. Unspoken, the way all the real rules of the Cascade Charter were unspoken. No music from the road speakers, no rev baiting at intersections. Just 40 machines running clean and steady through the Oregon high country, their exhaust trailing behind them like smoke from something that had burned a long time ago and never fully went out. The charter ran the route to honor the men who weren't riding anymore. The ones who came back from overseas in caskets, or who didn't come back at all, or who came back wrong and spent years making everyone around them pay for the privilege of their survival. Hammer Malone rode point the way he always did. Not because anyone elected him to it, because no one else wanted to be the one who decided the pace of grief. He was 43 years old, built like someone had taken a man and compressed him slightly in every direction, and he wore his years on his face in the way that men who have worked physically all their lives tend to. Not aged, exactly, but marked. There was a scar under his left ear that he never explained, and a stillness behind his eyes that the newer members of the club sometimes mistook for calm. It wasn't calm. It was the particular kind of stillness that comes from learning, through repetition, to hold everything down below the waterline. He'd been an emergency medic attached to a forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan for 2 deployments. He'd been good at it. That was the thing that still cut him when he let himself think about it at night. He had been genuinely, carefully, devastatingly good at keeping broken people alive under conditions that had no business permitting survival. And then one afternoon in a mountain village, in a situation that had gone wrong so fast, the sequence of events still played in his memory at triple speed, he'd failed. He'd failed in the specific, irreversible way that you only get to fail once before the universe makes sure you understand what failure actually costs. He didn't talk about it. The club knew not to ask. The sky that Saturday was the color of old concrete. Not threatening, not dramatic, just the flat, pressing gray that settles over the Pacific Northwest in November and stays until you've nearly forgotten what direct sunlight looks like. The highway ran through second-growth timber on both sides, tall Douglas firs pressing in close, and the air tasted of pine resin and cold and something faintly metallic. Hammer had his throttle set, and his mind in that middle distance that long highway miles produce, the kind of focused emptiness that is the closest thing to meditation most of these men ever get. He saw her at 200 yards. She was in the center of the lane, directly in his path, and his brain registered the problem, and his right hand pulled throttle, and his left grabbed brake simultaneously, and the whole column behind him responded to the sudden deceleration with that particular sound. 40 motorcycles coming off speed at once. That sounds less like traffic and more like a controlled explosion in reverse. He got the bike stopped with 20 feet to spare, and even as the machine was still rocking beneath him, he had his helmet off and was moving. The child was face down on the asphalt, barefoot. She was wearing a nightgown, light blue, printed with small yellow flowers. Completely wrong for the temperature. Completely wrong for a highway in the Oregon mountains in November. Her feet were torn, the soles cut by gravel, bleeding in thin lines onto the road surface. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Hammer crouched and put 2 fingers to the side of her throat and felt her pulse, rapid, thready, the pulse of someone running on adrenaline and terror. And then the child turned her face to look at him, and he understood immediately that she was conscious and that she had chosen to lie down in front of the motorcycles deliberately. She had made a decision. A 5-year-old had made a strategic decision about how to stop 40 men on a highway. He looked at her eyes. Brown, very dark, bloodshot at the corners, pupils slightly uneven, which meant something, filed it away. A bruise developing on her right cheekbone, small, the size of a thumb. "Hey," he said. His voice came out quiet. It always did in moments like this. "I've got you. You're okay. What's your name?" The child stared at him for a moment, at the leather vest, at the patches, at whatever she saw in his face, and then her mouth moved. "Sophie," she said. Her voice was barely audible over the wind through the trees. "Sophie Mueller." "Okay, Sophie." He kept his voice level. "Can you tell me what happened?" She didn't answer right away. Behind him, he could hear the other men cutting their engines one after another, the highway going progressively quieter, and then boots hitting asphalt as riders dismounted, and then Dex's voice. Dex was his road captain, a former Army Ranger with a voice like gravel in a coffee can, saying quietly to the others, "Give him room." Sophie's eyes moved past him to the line of men standing in the highway, and Hammer watched her face process what she was seeing. 40 large men in riding gear and leather vests, most of them with beards, most of them with the particular physical carriage of people who have spent time in places that left permanent adjustments to their posture and their reflexes. And he watched her decide something. "They're killing my mom," she whispered. The words hit him in a specific place, not in the chest the way people describe shock. Lower. Somewhere below the sternum, in the part of the body that holds the things you can't articulate. He kept his face still. "Where is your mom, Sophie?" She pointed. Not at the road. Off the highway, into the tree line, where a barely visible gravel track disappeared between the firs. He could see tire ruts. He could see that the brush on either side of the track had been recently disturbed. "How far?" he said. "I ran a long time," she said. "My feet hurt." He stood up and turned to Dex, and in 15 years of riding together, they had developed a communication system that operated mostly below the level of spoken language. Dex looked at the child, looked at Hammer's face, and said, "Scout team. Me, Reyes, and Parrish. Rest of the column holds here." "I'm going with you," Hammer said. "You're a medic," Dex said. It wasn't a question. "I was a medic," Hammer said. "Same thing." Dex turned to the column. "Boots, stay with the child. Don't let her out of your sight." Boots, whose real name was Carver, who was 6'4" and had hands like catcher's mitts, and a voice so gentle it sometimes startled people who judged by size, crouched down beside Sophie with the practiced ease of a man who had spent time around frightened children before. Sophie looked at him. He took off his riding gloves and held out one hand, palm up. She looked at his hand for a moment, and then she put her small bloodied hand into it. Hammer picked up his helmet, thought about it, and left it on the seat of his bike. The gravel track ran roughly a quarter mile into the trees before it opened onto a clearing, and the clearing held a cabin, the kind of structure that had been built with intention once, maybe 30 years ago, by someone who wanted isolation and had gotten it. The cabin was one story, wood-sided, the siding weathered gray. A vehicle was parked at an angle to the front porch, a late-model sedan, Oregon plates, the kind of anonymous car that rental companies stock in bulk, and one of the front tires was flat. The front door of the cabin was standing open. Nothing was moving. Hammer stood at the edge of the tree line with Dex and Reyes and Parrish, and all 4 of them processed the scene in the quiet, methodical way that men who have approached unknown structures in hostile environments tend to process things. Looking for movement, looking for light, listening. The only sound was wind through the fire needles, and faintly, what might have been the sound of running water from somewhere behind the cabin. "Doors open," Reyes said quietly. Reyes was their youngest full member, 28, former Marine, so covered in tattoos that his neck and the backs of his hands looked like illustrated manuscripts. He had a gift for stating the obvious in a tone that made it sound like intelligence. "Doors open," Dex agreed. They moved in two pairs. Hammer stayed close to Dex, and they crossed the open ground to the front porch in a wide arc that kept the sedan between them and the cabin door for as long as possible. Parrish and Reyes took the other side. The porch boards were soft with moisture, and Hammer's boots pressed into them almost silently. He smelled it before he saw it. Blood has a specific smell, copper and something organic underneath, something that the body recognizes before the conscious mind catches up. He'd smelled it in phobies and aid stations and the backs of medevac helicopters, and smelling it here in an Oregon clearing in November produced a reaction in his nervous system that bypassed thought entirely. He pushed through the open door. The interior of the cabin was a single large room, divided loosely into a kitchen area and a living area, with a hallway leading to what he assumed were a bedroom and a bathroom. The furniture was the anonymous, durable kind that furnished rentals: a couch, a table, 4 chairs, a child's drawing on the table, crayon on a piece of notebook paper, a small pair of sneakers by the door. The woman was on the floor in the kitchen area, between the counter and the table. Hammer crossed to her in 3 strides and was already on his knees before he'd fully processed her position. She was on her side, partially curled, and there was blood, from a wound on the side of her head, from her lip, from what he could see of a gash on her left forearm that had been trying to clot and hadn't fully succeeded. She was breathing. He could see her chest moving. He put his fingers to her throat. Pulse present, stronger than the child's, adult physiology under stress, more resources to draw on. He leaned close to her face. "Ma'am," he said. "Can you hear me?" A sound from her, not words, an attempt. "My name is Hammer Malone. He paused for less than a second. "I'm a medic. I'm going to help you. Can you open your eyes for me?" Her eyes opened. Gray eyes, very pale, the kind that look washed out in the wrong light and luminous in the right light. And right now they were tracking. She was conscious. She was trying to focus. She looked at his face, at his vest, at the patch on his chest that said Cascade Charter, in an arc over the club emblem. "Sophie," she said. Her voice was wrecked, strained and cracked and thin. "Sophie's safe," Hammer said. "She's with my people. She stopped us on the highway." Something moved through the woman's face, something between relief and grief, the way those two things sometimes occupy exactly the same space. "She ran," the woman said. "I told her to run." "She ran," Hammer confirmed. "She found us." He was already moving his hands, checking for structural injuries, running through the assessment in the efficient, organized way that had once been automatic, and now required more deliberate effort, as if the knowledge was still there but had to be manually retrieved from a deeper drawer. "What's your name?" "Greta," the woman said. "Greta Mueller." "Greta, do you know where you are?" "Rented cabin, outside Crestview." Her words were coming out in short segments, each one costing something. "We were hiding." Dex appeared in the doorway. Hammer looked up at him. "Whoever was here left in a hurry," Dex said. Back windows broken from the outside. Mud on the sill. Somebody came in that way. Tracks leading back into the trees, heading north. He paused. Tire tracks in the mud on the north side. Vehicle parked there and left recently. Greta made a sound, not a word, but the sound of someone absorbing a piece of information they had already suspected and were not surprised by and were devastated by anyway. "They found us," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who found you?" Hammer said. She looked at him. Her eyes were more focused now. Not recovered, nowhere near recovered, but present. She was deciding something. He could see her working through a calculation about whether to trust him, and he understood the calculation because it was reasonable. He was a stranger in a leather vest crouching over her in a rented cabin where someone had just tried to kill her, and the scale on which you weigh those things when you're lying in your own blood on a kitchen floor is not the same scale you use when you're in a position to be careful. "I work at Cascade Regional Hospital," she said finally. "I'm an oncologist. 3 weeks ago, I found something in the patient record system that I wasn't supposed to find." She paused, breathed. The breath was shallow and cost her something. People had been admitted to the hospital under false identities. Their records were being used, their diagnoses, their treatment histories. And there was a financial trail, Payment routing through the hospital's billing system to accounts I'd never seen. She paused again. I know what I was looking at. I've seen grant fraud before. This was bigger than grant fraud. Hammer looked at her steadily. I copied the files, Greta said, before I left, before I understood that they already knew I'd seen it. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them again. Sophie and I left the city 3 weeks ago. I thought we were careful. A breath. They found us anyway. Hammer was quiet for a moment. Where's the copy? He said. Greta looked at him, the calculation again. He watched it happen. USB drive, she said, in the lining of Sophie's sneaker. A pause that had a different quality to it. Not exhaustion, something more like shame, or the thing that sits next to shame. I put it there so that even if they got to me, she wouldn't know she had it. She couldn't tell them what she didn't know. She said it in the flat tone of a woman who had made a terrible decision for a reason that still seemed necessary and who had not yet had the distance to judge herself for it. Hammer looked toward the door where the small pair of sneakers sat beside the mat. Outside, one of the bike's radios crackled. Parrish's voice, low and controlled. Dex, we've got something on the north perimeter. Dex was already moving. Hammer stayed where he was, one hand on Greta's shoulder, feeling the tremor in her that she was working hard to suppress. Help is coming, he said. I need you to stay still. They'll come back, she said. He looked at her. Then he looked at the door. Then he looked back at her. I know, he said. And from the north perimeter, in the direction that Dex and Parrish had gone, came the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. Heavy, fast, moving directly toward the cabin. And then a voice Hammer didn't recognize, shouting something he couldn't quite make out. And then the particular sound that a man's voice makes when it goes from a shout to a grunt of pain in less than a second, which is a very specific sound and one that Hammer's nervous system had no trouble identifying at all. He put his hand on Greta's arm. Don't move, he said. He stood up. And then, because it was the only direction that made sense, he moved toward the door and whatever was coming through it. Hammer came through the cabin door with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes already moving, left, right, north perimeter, tree line, doing the kind of rapid threat assessment that the Army had drilled into him until it became less a skill and more a reflex, the way breathing is a reflex, the way flinching is a reflex, except this one had been installed deliberately and at considerable cost. What he found on the north side of the cabin was not what he'd expected. Dex had a man face down in the mud with one knee in the small of his back, and both the man's wrists controlled behind him, and the man was not fighting anymore. He had clearly tried fighting and had discovered the specific geometry of Dex's leverage and given up the project. Parrish was standing 6 feet back with his arms crossed, watching the tree line, the way Parrish always watched things, without apparent urgency, with complete attention. The man on the ground was young, mid-20s. He was wearing hiking gear, good gear, the expensive waterproof kind, and he had a camera hanging from a strap around his neck. The strap now twisted uncomfortably against his throat in a way that was probably not comfortable, but was not Dex's problem. He was breathing hard through his nose, his face turned sideways in the wet earth, one eye visible and wide, and communicating clearly that he had not anticipated his Saturday going in this direction. Who is he? Hammer said. Says he's a journalist, Dex said. He said it in the same tone he would use to say, says he's an astronaut. I am a journalist, the man said into the mud. What outlet? Hammer said. A pause. Freelance. Dex's knee increased its pressure by some small surgical amount. The man made a sound. What outlet? Hammer said again. Not louder, just more final. I'm working on a piece about Cascade Regional Hospital, the man said. The words came out compressed, like air escaping a puncture. Patient records fraud. I've been following Dr. Mueller for 2 weeks. I didn't know what had happened here. I came to talk to her. I heard the bikes, and I went around through the trees because I didn't want... He stopped. Please get off me. Hammer looked at Dex. Dex looked at Hammer. Name, Hammer said. Callum Marsh. You got ID, Callum Marsh? A wallet appeared from the man's jacket pocket, produced by Parrish, who had a gift for finding things in other people's clothing without making it feel like a search. Parrish handed it to Hammer. Press credential from the Oregon Independent Press Coalition. driver's license. A business card that had been folded in half and unfolded so many times the crease had worn through. The name matched. Hammer handed the wallet back. "Let him up," he said to Dex. Dex stood in a single smooth motion, the way large men who have spent serious time in physical training sometimes move, not gracefully exactly, but with the particular economy of someone who does not waste effort on performance. The journalist got to his feet in a less elegant fashion, spitting mud, one hand going to the camera to check it instinctively, the way journalists apparently check cameras the way soldiers check weapons. Callum Marsh was taller than he'd looked on the ground. He had the kind of face that was young enough to be unformed in some ways, and old enough in others to suggest that whatever he'd been working on had been aging him faster than his birth certificate would account for. He looked at the three men in front of him and made an obvious effort to organize himself. "She's inside," he said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen the blood on Hammer's hands. "She's alive," Hammer said. "That's all you need to know right now." Marsh's jaw tightened. "I've been working this story for 4 months. I have sources inside that hospital. I know what she found." "Then you know she almost died for it," Hammer said. "This morning, in there." He gestured toward the cabin without looking away from Marsh's face. "So whatever you came here for, it waits." Marsh looked at him. Then he looked at the cabin door. Then he looked back at Hammer, and something shifted in his expression. Not backing down, but recalibrating. "You're not cops," he said. "No," Hammer said. "Then who are you?" The answer to that question, Hammer thought, was something that would take longer than they had. "We're the ones who stopped," he said. "Now get out of the mud and make yourself useful or get back in your car." Marsh made a decision. Hammer could see it happen. "I can help," Marsh said. "I have documentation, sources. I know who's behind this." "Good," Dex said. "You can tell us all about it somewhere that isn't a crime scene." He said the word crime scene with a particular inflection that contained its own commentary on the day's developments. They went back into the cabin. The next 40 minutes were the kind of controlled chaos that Hammer had spent a significant portion of his adult life operating inside. Reyes had gone back to the highway to bring up the rest of the column. Not all of them, a rotating presence, enough to establish that the cabin was not undefended, and Boots had carried Sophie up the track in his arms, the child apparently having decided that Boots was acceptable and had fallen asleep against his chest in the way that exhausted children fall asleep, completely and without negotiation. He laid her on the couch, and she didn't wake up. Hammer worked on Greta with what he had, which was the trauma kit from his saddlebag. Every member of the Cascade Charter carried a trauma kit. This had been a standing requirement since a highway incident 4 years ago that nobody liked to discuss in detail. And what he found was that she was injured but not critically, which was either good luck or evidence that whoever had been in the cabin had been interrupted before they could finish. The head wound was shallow, a laceration from something blunt, bled heavily the way head wounds do without representing genuine structural damage. The gash on her forearm needed closure. Her ribs on the right side were either cracked or badly bruised. She pulled away from pressure there with a sharp intake of breath that confirmed it without requiring an X-ray. She needed a hospital. The specific irony of that particular need, given the circumstances, was not lost on either of them. "I can't go to Cascade Regional," Greta said. She was sitting up now, her back against the kitchen cabinets, and some color had come back into her face. Not much, the kind of color that is mostly stubbornness manifesting as physiology. "I know," Hammer said. He was closing the forearm wound with butterfly strips, working steadily, and he did not look up from the work when he said it. "The people who did this—" She stopped. He could feel her choosing her words with the kind of care that suggested she'd rehearsed this conversation with herself many times over the past 3 weeks, and it still hadn't gotten easier. "They have access to hospital systems. All hospital systems in this region are networked through the same administrative consortium. If I'm admitted under my name, they'd know within the hour," Hammer finished. A pause. "Yes." He finished the last butterfly strip and pressed a gauze pad over the assembly and looked at her face directly for the first time since he'd started working. She met his gaze without flinching, which told him something about her. People who had spent a lot of time flinching tended to have a different relationship with direct eye contact than people who hadn't yet learned they needed to. "There's a free clinic in Millhaven," he said. Off-network, cash only. The doctor there owes me a significant favor and doesn't ask questions he doesn't want answers to. He paused. It's 40 minutes. She looked at him for a moment. Why are you doing this? She said. It was a reasonable question. It was in fact the question that a reasonable person in her position would ask, and he respected her for asking it directly instead of just accepting help and worrying about the implications later. He thought about several answers, discarded them, and settled on the one that was truest and shortest. Your daughter stopped 40 motorcycles, he said, by lying down in the road. He paused. That required a specific kind of courage. I have a policy about courage. Greta's mouth did something complicated. Not quite a smile. More like the face that a smile lives behind when the circumstances haven't yet permitted the smile itself. The conflict arrived while Hammer was still organizing the transport. He'd expected pushback from the charter about the detour. The memorial ride was sacred. Everyone understood what it meant and what it cost to interrupt it. But the pushback that came was not about the ride. It came from Vic Strand, who had been with the Cascade Charter for 9 years, and who was standing near the cabin's front window with his arms crossed, and his expression doing the thing it did when Vic had made up his mind about something and was waiting for the right moment to make it everyone else's problem. Vic was 51, stocky, with a gray beard. He kept trimmed close, and eyes that were a particularly pale shade of blue that suggested either Scandinavian ancestry or the specific kind of interior weather that makes a man's eyes look like overcast sky regardless of genetics. He'd done 12 years as a prison guard before the Cascade Charter, and those 12 years had left a particular sediment in his personality, a constant, low-grade suspicion of everyone's motives, including his own, and a tendency to identify the worst possible interpretation of any situation before considering alternatives. We don't know her, Vic said. He said it to Dex, which was technically correct as a chain of command matter, but he said it at a volume that made it everyone's business. Dex looked at him. We know the kid, Dex said. We know the kid stopped us on the highway, Vic said. That's all we know. He paused, looked toward the couch where Sophie was sleeping, looked back. I'm not saying leave them. I'm saying we call the county sheriff, we make sure they've got help coming, and we continue our ride. Another pause. That's what we're here for. That's what today is. The cabin got quiet in a specific way. Not the absence of sound, because there were still engines running outside and wind against the windows and the small sounds that a sleeping child makes, but the particular quiet that a room produces when the people in it are all paying close attention to something nobody wants to be the first to say out loud. Hammer kept his eyes on Vic. County sheriff response time out here is 45 minutes minimum, Hammer said. The people who did this left in a vehicle less than an hour ago. They know she's alive. They know they didn't finish. He let that sit for a moment. You want to leave a woman with cracked ribs and a concussion and a sleeping 5-year-old in a cabin with one door and a broken back window to wait 45 minutes for a county deputy. I want to do what we came here to do, Vic said. His voice was flat and steady, which is remember our people, not inherit someone else's war. Vic, Dex said quietly. No. Vic uncrossed his arms. His voice didn't rise. Vic's voice almost never rose, which made it more effective when it turned hard. I've got nothing against her, nothing against the kid, but every time we stop for something like this, we end up in the middle of something we don't have the right to be in the middle of. And people get hurt. Our people. He looked at Hammer. You know I'm right. The room absorbed that. Because the thing about Vic Strand was that he was not wrong, exactly. He was applying a logic that was coherent and that had been validated by experience. And the experience he was referencing was real, and it had hurt real people, and Hammer was not in a position to pretend otherwise. 4 years ago, the charter had intervened in a situation that had seemed straightforward and had turned out to be considerably more complicated. And before it was resolved, a man named Terrence Webb, who everyone called Sparks, who had been with the charter for 11 years and had a daughter in Bend, who he was slowly, effortfully rebuilding a relationship with, had taken a bullet in his left side that had cost him a kidney and most of the hearing in his left ear and the better part of 18 months of his life. Sparks still rode. He was outside right now, in fact, standing next to his bike in the cold. But the shape of his posture had changed in the years since. and anyone who knew what he'd looked like before could see the change and understand what it represented. Hammer looked at Vic for a long moment. "I know what happened with Sparks," he said. "I know it every day." He paused. "I'm not asking the charter to fight somebody else's war. I'm asking the charter to get a woman and a child to a clinic 40 minutes away and then figure out what comes next." He looked around the room, at Dex, at Reyes, at Parrish, at the two other members who had come up from the highway. "That's all I'm asking right now, the next thing. Not the whole war." Vic looked at him for a long time. Then he looked out the window. Then he uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his jacket pockets, which was as close as Vic Strand came to conceding a point. "One run to the clinic," Vic said. "After that, we sit down and talk about what this actually is before anybody makes any more decisions." "Agreed," Hammer said. He turned back toward Greta, and as he turned, he caught a look from Dex. Brief, neutral, the specific look that Dex used to communicate this isn't finished. And Hammer gave the specific micro-nod that meant, "I know." Because he did know. The thing Vic had put in the room was not going to dissolve just because they'd agreed on the immediate next step. It was going to sit there through the drive to Millhaven, and through the clinic, and through whatever came after, and eventually it was going to demand a real answer. The journalist, Callum Marsh, had been sitting at the kitchen table during this exchange with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that in certain rooms, visibility is a liability. Now he looked at Hammer. "I can ride with you," he said. "I should be there when she—" "You should stay here," Hammer said, "and not touch anything." Marsh's jaw worked. "I've been working this story for 4 months. Those files, whatever she copied, they corroborate 2 of my sources who are terrified to go on record. Without physical documentation, I've got nothing publishable. I've got nothing that protects anyone." He paused. "You understand what I'm telling you? The story is the protection. The moment it's public, the people behind this lose the only reason they have to keep hurting people." Hammer looked at him. He thought about arguing with this logic and found that he couldn't, quite, which was annoying. "You stay here," he said. "Dex stays with you. When we're back, you tell us everything you have. Everything. Not the version you'd print. Everything." He held Marsh's gaze. "And if I find out you're running any part of this before we've agreed it's safe to run, I will make sure the story you end up with is the one about a journalist who got a woman killed by prioritizing his byline." Marsh absorbed this without visible reaction, which meant he'd received similar warnings before and had developed the emotional calluses that come with repeated exposure. "Understood," he said. Sophie woke up while they were preparing to move her mother. She woke up the way traumatized children sometimes wake. Not gradually, not with the soft transition of normal sleep, but all at once, sitting upright on the couch with her eyes wide and her small hands gripping the cushion on either side of her, and her breath coming fast. Boots was there in 2 steps. He crouched in front of her without touching her. "Hey," he said. "Hey, you're okay. You're still here." Sophie looked at him, looked around the room, found Hammer across the space. "Where's my mom?" she said. "Right here," Greta said from the kitchen area. Her voice was still wrecked, but she'd made it carry, and Sophie's head snapped toward her. Something passed through the child's face that was too complicated for her age, relief and fear together, the way those things coexist in people who have recently learned that the people they love are fragile. Sophie crossed the room and pressed herself against her mother's side, carefully, as if she somehow understood about the ribs without being told, and Greta put one arm around her and closed her eyes. Hammer looked away from that, because some moments are not for observers. The ride to Millhaven was tense, in the way that rides are tense when they're carrying something valuable, and the road is empty, and the sky is the color of concrete, and everyone's threat assessment systems are running at full capacity. Greta and Sophie rode in the back seat of the sedan, the flat tire changed by Reyes in 8 minutes flat, driven by a charter member named Grover, who had been a professional driver before the Army and had remained profoundly careful about it after. 6 bikes rode escort, 3 ahead and 3 behind, and the formation moved through the mountain roads at the exact legal speed limit with the particular discipline of men who understood that the wrong kind of attention at the wrong moment was its own category of danger. Hammer rode third in the front formation and spent the 40 minutes thinking about the USB drive. It was in his jacket pocket now, Greta had told him to take it from Sophie's sneaker before they left the cabin, and he'd done it, and now he was riding through cold November air with evidence of what appeared to be a significant institutional crime in his inside pocket, and he was thinking about all the ways this could go badly and ranking them in rough order of probability. The list was long enough to carry him most of the way to Millhaven. Dr. Kwame Asante met them at the back entrance of the Millhaven Free Clinic, as Hammer had arranged by phone on the road, and he did it without audible complaint, which represented the specific texture of the favor that Hammer had mentioned. Asante was 60, compact, with reading glasses perpetually on his forehead and the bedside manner of a man who had spent 30 years treating people who didn't have insurance and didn't have options and had learned to be efficient and warm simultaneously because efficiency without warmth, in his experience, produced worse outcomes, and he had the data to prove it. He looked at Greta, looked at Sophie, and said to Hammer, "Waiting room's clear. Bring them in." The clinic's back hallway smelled of antiseptic and old coffee and something floral that was probably an air freshener working hard against the other two things. Hammer sat in a plastic chair in the hallway while Asante took Greta into an exam room, and Sophie sat in the chair beside him because she had declined to be put in the waiting room and no one had pushed the point. She sat very straight, which was the posture of a child who was trying to be old enough for the situation she was in. They sat in silence for a while. Hammer was not particularly uncomfortable with silence, and Sophie appeared to have developed a relationship with silence that was beyond her years. "Are you a doctor?" she said eventually. "Was," he said. "Why aren't you anymore?" He considered how to answer this. "I made a mistake," he said. It wasn't the full answer, but it was a true piece of it, and he had found that children could generally absorb true pieces better than adults could absorb complicated explanations. Sophie considered this. "Does my mom make mistakes?" "I don't know her well enough to say." He paused. "Everyone does." "She says doctors can't afford to make mistakes." Sophie's voice was matter-of-fact, the voice of a child repeating something she'd heard many times, the way children incorporate overheard adult conclusions into their worldview without yet having the context to fully evaluate them. "She says one mistake can cost a life." Hammer looked down at his hands, the butterfly strips on his fingertips from the work he'd done on Greta's arm. "She's right," he said, "but not making any more mistakes after the first one. That's what matters." Sophie seemed to file this. "The men who hurt my mom," she said, "are they going to come back?" He looked at her. She was looking straight ahead at the hallway wall, and her profile was absolutely calm in the specific way that fear, past a certain level of saturation, sometimes looks indistinguishable from composure. "No," he said. He said it with the tone that he reserved for things he intended to make true, which was a different tone from the tone he used for things he merely believed. Sophie nodded once, as if this settled something. Then she reached over and put her hand on top of his, not squeezing, just resting it there the way a small creature will sometimes rest against something solid when the ground beneath it has been unstable for too long. Hammer did not move. He sat with the weight of her hand on his and the USB drive in his pocket and the sound of Millhaven's afternoon traffic outside the frosted window, and he thought about the moment on the highway when she had lain down in the road, and he thought about the particular kind of courage that required. And he thought about the policy he'd mentioned to her mother. And he thought about the last time he'd held a promise like this one and what had happened to it. Asante came out 40 minutes later. "Ribs? 3 cracked on the right side, none displaced," he said. He said it the way doctors say things when they're being clinically precise and simultaneously compassionate, directly, without softening, but with a steadiness in the delivery that communicated that he was not alarmed. "Concussion, moderate, forearm closure. I'm going to redo your butterfly technique is fine, but I want sutures on that one." He looked at Hammer. "She needs rest and monitoring for the next 48 hours, and she can't go back to wherever she came from." "She's not going back," Hammer said. Asante looked at him for a moment with the specific look of a man assessing another man's level of commitment to a statement. He appeared to decide he was satisfied. "There's a room above the clinic," he said. "It's not comfortable, it's clean, and it has a lock on the door." He paused. I'm going to tell you once that I don't want to know what this is, and after that I'm going to stop telling you that and simply not ask." "Understood," Hammer said. "Thank you, Kwame." "Don't thank me," Asante said. "Return the favor some other way, some other time. You're good at that." He went back into the exam room. Sophie had fallen asleep again in the plastic chair, slumped sideways against Hammer's arm, and Hammer sat with his phone in his free hand and pulled up a contact and stared at it for a long time before pressing call. The contact was labeled only with a set of initials. The number had a 202 area code. It rang twice. A voice answered, a woman's voice, professional and guarded in the specific way of people whose entire professional existence consists of managing information carefully. "Marsh," the voice said. "Not Callum Marsh. A different Marsh." "This is Malone," Hammer said quietly, keeping his voice low enough not to wake the child. "I need a favor." A pause. "I heard you left the service." "I left the army," he said. "Not everything." Another pause, this one longer, with a different quality. "What do you need?" "I need to know who runs the administrative network for the Cascade Regional Hospital System," he said. "The Patient Records Consortium, specifically who sits on the oversight board and whether any of those names appear in any federal investigation in the last 3 years." Silence on the line, a silence that had information in it. "That's a specific question," the woman said. "I have specific reasons," Hammer said. "Send me what you have," she said. "I'll see what's there." A pause. "Malone, how bad is this?" He looked at the USB drive in his palm. He thought about Greta on the cabin floor. He thought about Sophie in the road. He thought about Vic Strand and the look on his face and the weight of what Vic had put in the room and the fact that Vic was not wrong about what this was going to cost. "Bad enough," he said. He ended the call and sat in the hallway with the sleeping child against his arm and the evidence of something very large and very carefully organized hidden in his closed fist, and he thought, there is a point in every situation where the decision stops being a decision and starts being a consequence, where what you are is revealed not by what you choose, but by the fact that you've already been choosing all along, and this moment is simply the one where the bill arrives. His phone buzzed, a text from Dex back at the cabin. 4 words. No punctuation, because Dex never used punctuation in texts, a habit that had always mildly irritated Hammer in the way that very small things irritate you about people you trust completely. "Marsh is not alone." Hammer stared at the message. Then another buzz. 5 more words. Someone followed him here from Portland. And then, before Hammer could respond, a 3rd message, and this one changed the geometry of everything that had come before it, and everything that would follow, because what it said was not a warning about physical danger or an operational complication or any of the categories of problem that Hammer had been mentally organizing and ranking in order of probability for the last several hours. What it said was a name that Hammer recognized, a name from a specific file he'd read a specific number of years ago, in a specific context that he had spent considerable effort not thinking about since, and which now appeared in a text message from Dex's phone in a Millhaven clinic hallway while a 5-year-old slept against his arm, and the name landed in Hammer Malone's chest with the precise weight and velocity of something that has been falling for a long time. He was already standing, already scanning the hallway exits, already calculating, before the full conscious understanding of what the name meant had finished assembling itself, because some things the body understands before the mind does. And the body, in this moment, understood that the situation had just become something fundamentally and irreversibly different from what it had been an hour ago, and that there was no version of the next decision that did not carry a cost that someone in this building was going to have to pay. The name on Dex's text was Raymond Cahill. Hammer stood in the clinic hallway with Sophie still warm against his arm and the phone in his hand and the name sitting in his vision like something burned onto the back of his eyes. And his first response was the specific kind of stillness that the body produces when the mind has encountered something it was not prepared for and needs 3 full seconds to confirm that it is actually real and not a product of stress and sleep deprivation and the accumulated psychological weight of the last several hours. It was real. Raymond Cahill, 54 years old, former Department of Defense contractor. former senior advisor to the Joint Medical Logistics Command, which was the branch of the military supply apparatus responsible for coordinating medical resources across forward operating bases and active combat zones. A man whose name appeared in a classified after-action review that Hammer had been compelled to read in a small room at Fort Lewis in the spring of the year after his second deployment, in the presence of 2 officers and a civilian lawyer who had advised him in very precise language that the contents of that review were not to be discussed outside the specific context of the investigation, and that the investigation had been closed without findings, and that he was free to go. Free to go. He'd spent 8 years going. And now Raymond Cahill had followed a freelance journalist to a rented cabin in the Oregon mountains on the same morning that Hammer had stopped on a highway for a barefoot child. He gently extracted his arm from beneath Sophie's head, repositioned her against the chair back, and walked to the far end of the hallway before pressing call on Dex's number. Dex picked up on the first ring. "You know him," Dex said. Not a question. "How close is he?" Hammer said. He was in a vehicle parked on the Forest Service Road about half a mile north of the cabin. Gray SUV, rental plates. Marsh didn't make him. I don't think Marsh knew he had a tail. A pause. He's not here anymore. Left when we moved the woman. Does he know where we went? He followed us to the highway junction, Dex said. Then he stopped, parked on the shoulder and watched the column split. Couldn't follow without being seen. Another pause. Ray has got his plate. I ran it. And? Registered to a shell company out of Portland. 3 layers of incorporation. 4th layer. Dex stopped. Hammer. 4th layer comes back to a subsidiary of Meridian Health Partners. The words landed with the specific impact of something that confirms the suspicion you were hoping was wrong. Meridian Health Partners was the administrative consortium that managed the networked records system for 11 hospitals in the Pacific Northwest, including Cascade Regional. Hammer knew this because Greta had told him. He knew it with more texture than that because his contact in Washington had texted him 40 minutes ago, the first layer of the answer to the question he'd asked, and that answer had included the name Meridian Health Partners and 3 board members whose names appeared in 2 separate ongoing federal investigations that his contact had been careful not to specify by name or case number. Raymond Cahill's vehicle was registered through 4 corporate layers to the company at the center of what Greta Mueller had found in the patient records. The company that had sent men to a rented cabin to ensure that what she'd found stayed buried. "Where's Marsh?" Hammer said. "In the cabin. I've got Parrish with him." A beat. "He doesn't know any of this." "Keep it that way for now." Hammer pressed his back against the hallway wall and looked at the ceiling. The fluorescent light above him had a flicker in it, a very slight irregularity, the kind of thing you only notice when you have nothing to do but stand in a hallway and think. "Dex, Cahill was my commanding officer's logistics liaison in Cunard Province. 2011, second deployment." Silence on the line. "He was responsible for the medical supply chain to our FOB, Hammer said. "He was the reason our forward aid station was running on expired blood products and compromised suture kits for 6 weeks before anyone at command level acknowledged the problem." He stopped. Started again. The official investigation, concluded that it was a procurement error, supply chain documentation failure, nobody's fault. He paused on those last 2 words with a quality that made them mean their opposite. 3 soldiers died in that aid station during those 6 weeks who might not have died with adequate supplies. One of them was 22 years old and from Medford, Oregon, and her name was Corporal Diane Wexler, and she had a mother who still sends a Christmas card to an address I haven't lived at in 4 years. The fluorescent light flickered. Dex said nothing for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a man choosing each word with the kind of deliberateness that substitutes for the physical response he would prefer to have. "So this isn't random," he said. "No," Hammer said. "I don't think it ever was." "You think Cahill connected you to Mueller?" "I think Cahill had Marsh under surveillance because Marsh was getting close to the hospital story," Hammer said. "I think when Marsh's trail led to the cabin, Cahill sent people ahead to deal with the problem before Marsh got there. And I think when 40 motorcycles showed up on the highway and the woman survived and the bikers moved her to an unknown location, he stopped. I think Cahill now has a problem that is significantly larger than a freelance journalist and a doctor with a USB drive. He has the Cascade Charter, Dex said. He has the Cascade Charter, Hammer agreed. Another silence. This one had weight to it. The specific weight of a decision being made by a man who has made decisions of this category before and knows what they cost and is making it anyway. I'll call the brothers in, Dex said. Not all of them, Hammer said immediately. Vic will want to know, Dex said. Vic will want to leave, Hammer said. And he might be right to want that. But I need to know what's on that drive before anyone makes any decisions about what comes next. He pushed off the wall. Get Marsh talking. Everything he has on Meridian, on Cahill, on the hospital board. I need the full picture before I walk back in that room and ask 40 men to do something I can't fully justify yet. Hammer. Dex's voice dropped a register. If Cahill connects you specifically to this, if he knows it's you, then this is already personal, Hammer said. And it was personal before we stopped on that highway. He ended the call and stood for a moment in the flickering hallway, and then he went back to the exam room and knocked, and Asante opened the door, and Hammer looked past him at Greta, who was sitting up on the exam table with fresh sutures on her forearm and a compression wrap on her ribs, and the particular expression of someone who has been through enough in the last 12 hours that additional bad news will be processed rather than survived. I need to ask you something, Hammer said. Asante said, I'll check on the girl, and left without being asked to, which was one of the reasons that Hammer had maintained the connection with him over the years. Greta looked at him. What happened? The man who organized the attack on your cabin, Hammer said. Does the name Raymond Cahill mean anything to you? He watched her face. He was watching specifically for the micro-expressions that occur in the first half-second after a name lands, before the conscious mind can organize a response, before the decision about what to reveal has been made, because in his experience that half-second was where the truth lived. What he saw was recognition, and beneath the recognition, something older, something that had the texture of something encountered before, filed away, not fully resolved. He was on the hospital board, she said. Until 18 months ago. He resigned. She paused. It was quiet. No announcement. He was just gone from the letterhead. She looked at Hammer steadily. I noted it at the time because his resignation coincided, almost exactly, with the period when the irregularities in the patient records first appeared. You didn't include that in what you copied. I didn't know it was relevant, she said. I know it now. Greta. He moved to the chair beside the exam table and sat down so they were on the same level, because some conversations require that geometry. The man has a history that connects to me, specifically to me from before today, which means there is a possibility, I want you to understand this clearly. There is a possibility that what happened at your cabin and what happened on that highway are not as coincidental as they look. She absorbed this with the stillness of someone who has already passed through the phase of being shocked and arrived at the phase of needing information. You think he knew you would be on that road, she said. I think he might have known the charter ran that route every November, Hammer said. I think he had Marsh under surveillance, and Marsh led him to you, and his people went to the cabin. Whether the highway was part of it, or whether it became part of it when Sophie stopped us, I don't know yet. He looked at her. But I need you to understand that you and Sophie may not be the only reason his attention is on us now. Greta was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. The after-action review, she said. The one that was closed without findings. She said it carefully, as if handling something that had edges. I found references to it in the financial records, in the Meridian files. She looked at him. There were payments, routed through a medical supply subsidiary, to accounts associated with DoD contractor oversight. She paused. I didn't understand what I was looking at when I copied it. I do now. The room was very quiet. The fraud at the hospital, she said. The stolen patient records. The billing manipulation. It isn't the primary operation, it's the funding mechanism. She held his gaze. They've been running the same scheme for over a decade. Military supply contracts first. When that channel closed after the investigation, they moved into civilian healthcare. Same network, same financial architecture, just different victims. Hammer sat with this for a moment. It's all on the drive, he said. Everything I could copy before they realized I'd seen it, she said, including the payment records from 2011. He stood up. He stood up because sitting down was no longer a thing his body was capable of. He moved to the window, small, frosted, facing the clinic's rear parking area where two charter bikes sat at angles in the gray afternoon light. And he put one hand flat against the wall beside it and looked at the frosted glass and thought about Corporal Diane Wexler and her mother's Christmas cards, and the 3 seconds he'd spent on that aid station floor after she was gone, doing nothing because there was nothing left to do, and the way that nothing had felt like it was going to swallow him whole and had partially succeeded. He'd spent 8 years not knowing why the supplies had been inadequate. He'd spent 8 years inside the official explanation, procurement error, documentation failure, nobody's fault, because the alternative was a kind of rage that had nowhere productive to go and would have consumed him if he'd let it find a direction. It had a direction now. He turned away from the window. Rest, he said to Greta. We'll be back. He found Sophie in the waiting room with Asante, the two of them at a small table with a piece of paper and a pen. Sophie was drawing something with the focused intensity that children bring to drawing, the pen gripped in her whole fist, the tip of her tongue visible at the corner of her mouth. Asante glanced up at Hammer with the specific look of a man who wants to ask a question and has decided not to. I need to go back to the cabin for a few hours, Hammer said. To Sophie, not to Asante. Dr. Asante is going to stay with you and your mom. Sophie stopped drawing. She looked at him. You're coming back, she said. Again, not a question. The same quality she'd had on the highway. A child who had learned to state things as facts when the alternative was uncertainty she couldn't afford. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a moment with those dark, bloodshot eyes. Then she picked up the pen and went back to drawing, which he understood to be the acceptance it was. He rode back to the cabin in the cold, his throttle set high, the highway empty in both directions, the tree line a dark blur on either side, and he spent the miles doing what he always did on long road stretches, letting the engine noise fill the part of his head where thinking happened, giving the information he'd gathered time to settle into something like a pattern. By the time he turned onto the gravel track, the pattern was there. It was not a comfortable pattern. It had the shape of something that had been inevitable from a specific moment 8 years ago and had simply been waiting for the conditions that would allow it to become visible. The cabin had changed in his absence, not physically. The structure was the same, the mud was the same, the flat light through the firs was the same, but there were more bikes in the clearing now, 7 of them, and there were men standing in configurations that told him that whatever Dex had said to the brothers had been enough to bring them in from the highway. Vic Strand was leaning against the cabin's exterior wall with his arms crossed and his expression arranged in the specific way that it arranged itself when Vic had been waiting for something and had used the waiting time to build a case. Hammer parked and killed the engine and swung off the bike and walked toward the cabin door. Hammer, Vic said. He stopped. Turned. Inside, he said. Everyone. The cabin was too small for 8 men comfortably, and the 8 men made it smaller by the weight of what they were carrying into it. Callum Marsh was at the table with a laptop open and papers spread around it, and the look of a man who had been talked to by Dex and had decided that full cooperation was the most strategically sound position available to him. Parrish was by the window. Reyes and 3 others, Grover, a man they called Stitch, who had been an army combat medic like Hammer, and a newer member named Cole, who was 26 and the quietest person Hammer had ever encountered in a motorcycle club, arranged themselves around the room's perimeter. Dex stood by the hallway. Hammer stood in the center and told them. He told them about Raymond Cahill. He told them about the DoD contract and the supply chain and the inadequate blood products and the compromised sutures and the after-action review that had been closed without findings. He told them about Corporal Diane Wexler, which was something he had never told any of them before. He watched their faces as he said her name, and he registered the particular shift that moved through a room full of veterans when the name of a specific dead person is spoken. Not sentiment, exactly, but the specific weight of recognition, the acknowledgement that a death is not an abstraction. He told them what Greta had found in the Meridian files. The payment records, the decade-long financial architecture, the hospital fraud as a secondary operation funding something older and larger. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when the people in them are processing something that has changed the fundamental parameters of their situation. Vic was the first to speak. "You knew Cahill from before," he said. "Yes," Hammer said. "Before today. Before the highway." "Yes." Vic's pale eyes were very steady. "So when you said this morning that we should help, that we should take the woman to the clinic, you didn't know this yet, but this was already underneath it." He paused. "There was already a connection between you and whatever we were walking into." "I didn't know that this morning," Hammer said. "I found out an hour ago." "But it's there," Vic said. "It's there," Hammer agreed. He did not look away from Vic's face. Vic absorbed this. He uncrossed his arms and put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the floor. He looked back up. "How long have you been carrying the Wexler thing?" he said. It wasn't what Hammer had expected him to say. He'd expected an argument about risk and exposure and the charter's institutional interests. He hadn't expected Vic Strand to ask about Diane Wexler. 8 years, Hammer said. Vic nodded, very slowly, the nod of a man calibrating something internal. "My brother did 3 tours, he said. He came back with a TBI and a list of things the VA told him weren't service-connected. He said it without particular emotion, the way men of a certain type say things that contain enormous amounts of feeling by stripping the feeling from the delivery. He's been fighting that list for 6 years. He paused. The people who decide what's service-connected and what isn't. The administrators, the contractors, the people with their hands in the funding mechanisms. He stopped. I know what that architecture looks like. I've been watching it eat my brother for 6 years. The room was listening. I want to see what's on that drive, Vic said. Hammer looked at him for a moment. Then he took the USB drive from his jacket pocket and put it on the table in front of Marsh. What came off the drive took 40 minutes to get through, and Marsh walked them through it with the organized efficiency of a journalist who had spent 4 months building context around exactly this kind of documentation. The patient records fraud was sophisticated. False identities admitted through the hospital system, real diagnoses attached to fabricated patient histories, insurance billing at maximum rates, the payments routed through a series of accounts before arriving at Meridian subsidiary structures. The amounts were significant. Over 4 years, the operation had generated approximately $12 million in fraudulent billing. But the older records, the ones Greta had found that predated the hospital operation, those were something else. Medical supply contracts, DoD invoices, payments to shell entities that Hammer recognized from the after-action review he'd been shown once and never allowed to photograph, as the same structures that had been identified as anomalous and then declared irrelevant to the investigation's scope. The same financial fingerprints, years apart, connecting a military logistics failure to a civilian healthcare fraud through a thread of incorporated entities that had been carefully maintained across a decade. Raymond Cahill's name appeared 17 times in the older documents, twice in the newer ones using a different name, a middle name, Hammer noted, which was the kind of simple operational adjustment that worked because most oversight systems weren't looking for it. He's been doing this for over 10 years, Marsh said. He said it quietly, the way you say things when the full scope of something becomes visible and the scope is larger than you'd estimated even when you'd been estimating large. The hospital fraud is Phase 2. Phase 1 was military contracts. When the investigation started getting close, when the after-action review was commissioned, he restructured, moved the network, changed the vehicles. He looked at Hammer. The investigation that got closed. What ended it? Insufficient evidence, Hammer said. Or sufficient pressure, Marsh said. No one argued with this. Stitch, who had been silent through all of it, said from his position against the far wall, "He's going to know where we are eventually." His voice was very level. Stitch was 45 and had the specific kind of calm that comes from having worked in acute trauma settings, where panic is not an option and is therefore eventually eliminated as a response mode. If he's been watching Marsh and Marsh led him to the cabin, and the cabin led him to the highway, he has the charter's description. He knows the patches. He can ID the Cascade charter without much effort, and he knows we have the woman and the evidence. He paused. The question isn't whether he comes for us. The question is how fast. The room took this in. There's something else, Marsh said. Every head turned toward him. He had the expression of a man about to say something he'd been holding back, not from dishonesty, but from the specific reluctance of someone who knows that the thing they're about to say will change the room's temperature and has been waiting for the right moment to accept that consequence. The federal investigators, he said. The ones looking at Meridian. I have a source inside that investigation. He paused. My source told me 3 weeks ago that the investigation had hit a wall, that documentation they needed had been flagged as potentially classified due to the DoD connection, and that the classification review was being handled by an office that... He stopped, started again. An office that has Raymond Cahill's former business partner as its deputy director. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones that had come before it. This one had the quality of a door closing. The investigation is being managed, Dex said. The investigation is being strangled slowly enough that it looks like procedure, Marsh said. Yes. Hammer looked at the papers on the table. He looked at the USB drive sitting in the center of them. He looked at the faces of the men around the room, Dex with his jaw set, Vic with his pale eyes doing their overcast sky calculation, Reyes with the particular stillness of a man deciding something, Stitch with his trauma-trained calm, Cole with the watchful silence that Hammer had come to understand was not passivity, but attention of a very high order. If we go to the federal investigators with this, Hammer said, there's a mechanism in place to bury it. Yes, Marsh said. If we go to state law enforcement, Cascade Regional's billing fraud crosses state lines, Marsh said. Jurisdictionally, it goes federal. State law enforcement refers it up. He paused. To the same federal investigation. So the legal channel is compromised, Dex said. The legal channel is being sat on by someone with a personal interest in keeping it slow, Marsh said. That's not the same as permanently closed. But it means if we send the evidence up that channel today, Cahill has time to move before the bureaucratic delay resolves. He looked at the table. He's had time to prepare for this. He's been preparing for years. He looked up. What he hasn't prepared for is this becoming public before he can contain it. You want to publish, Vic said. His voice had a specific flatness. I want to publish, Marsh said. Tonight. Online, with the full document set. My editor is standing by. We've been waiting for the physical evidence. This is the physical evidence. He paused. Once it's public, the federal investigation has to respond visibly. The classification review becomes untenable. Cahill loses the ability to manage the timeline. And we become the people who leaked classified adjacent DoD material to a journalist, Hammer said. You become the people who exposed a decade-long criminal fraud network that killed soldiers and defrauded hospital patients, Marsh said. The framing is going to depend on who gets to tell the story first. Hammer looked at him for a long time. If we do this, he said, it goes public tonight. Before Cahill can move, he knows we have the evidence within hours, maybe less. He paused. He comes for us directly, not through intermediaries, directly. Yes, Marsh said. He had the grace not to soften it. Hammer looked at Dex. Dex looked back at him with the expression that substituted for a speech. He looked at Vic. Vic was looking at the table. Then Vic looked up. My brother's name is Daniel Strand, Vic said. He drove supply convoys in Kandahar, 2009, 2010. He said it to the room, not to any particular person. 3 TBIs. The third one cost him his left side vision. The VA says it's not service-connected. He paused. Whatever was in those supply chains, whatever was being cut and billed and pocketed by people like Cahill, it touched my brother. He looked at Hammer. I didn't know that this morning. I know it now. He took his hands out of his pockets. I'm not leaving, Reyes said from his position near the door. Nobody's leaving. It wasn't quite accurate. Cole hadn't spoken, and Grover was looking at the floor, but the weight of it moved through the room and landed as a kind of consensus. Hammer looked at Marsh. How long do you need to publish? 2 hours, Marsh said. If I start now. Hammer looked at his phone. 4:47 p.m., dark in another hour and a half. He thought about Greta in the clinic above Mill Haven. He thought about Sophie drawing with a borrowed pen. He thought about the gray SUV on the Forest Service Road and the question of where Raymond Cahill was right now and what he was doing with the time he had. He thought about the after-action review, the small room at Fort Lewis, the civilian lawyer who had told him he was free to go. Start, he said to Marsh. Marsh opened his laptop and his hands were already moving when the window on the north side of the cabin blew inward. Not broke, blew. The entire frame, glass, and wood, and the cheap aluminum hardware that held it came in as a unit propelled by a concussive force from outside, and the sound arrived half a second after the physical event, because the physical event happened too fast for sound to lead it, and the cabin filled with cold air and the smell of something chemical and the sound of men moving, boots on wood, chairs scraping, a table going over. And Hammer was already low, already moving toward the door, and somewhere in the chaos Parrish's voice cut through with one word only, that rearranged everything. Truck, Parrish said. And through the blown-out window frame, visible in the last gray light of the November afternoon, a black truck was positioned at the north edge of the clearing with its engine running and 3 figures moving around it with the organized, deliberate purpose of people who had been briefed on exactly where the men inside would be standing. Hammer hit the floor and felt the cold from the broken window on his face and smelled the chemical smell and understood. Medic's understanding, involuntary, coming from the part of his training that didn't switch off. What the chemical smell meant, and had approximately 2 seconds to decide what to do with that understanding before the next thing happened. And what he did with those 2 seconds was look across the tilted, chaotic space of the cabin at Dex, who was already looking at him, and in the specific nonverbal language of 15 years of riding together, he communicated exactly one thing. Get to the bikes. Because the USB drive was in Marsh's laptop, and Marsh's laptop was on the overturned table, and the men outside were not coming in to negotiate. And if the evidence went down in this cabin tonight, then Diane Wexler and every patient in every bed that Meridian Health Partners had ever fraudulently billed, and every soldier who had ever bled out on a forward operating base, while the supply chain that should have saved him was being systematically stripped for profit, would stay buried under the specific, durable, carefully maintained silence of people who had learned that silence, maintained aggressively enough and at sufficient cost, was indistinguishable from truth. That was not going to happen. Hammer Malone had been free to go once before, and he had gone. And he had spent 8 years understanding what going had cost, and he was not going again. And the specific quality of that decision, the way it settled into his chest with the permanence of something that has been decided at a level below choice, was something he recognized, because he had felt it once before, in a different country, in a different year, in the moment before he had done the most effective and most costly thing he had ever done in his life. The thing he had never been able to talk about and had never been able to stop thinking about, and which had, in ways he was only now beginning to understand, been pulling him toward this specific cabin, in this specific clearing, in these specific November woods since the moment it happened. He grabbed Marsh by the collar and pulled him toward the door and said one word, "Move!" And somewhere behind them, the chemical smell reached a threshold, and the north wall of the cabin began to burn. The north wall was burning, and Hammer had Marsh by the collar, and the cabin door was 8 feet away, and the 8 feet felt like a calculation rather than a distance. The kind of calculation you do in the space between heartbeats, when the variables are moving too fast for deliberate thought, and the only reliable instrument is the body's accumulated knowledge of how much time things take. Dex hit the door first, not opened it, hit it, shoulder first, the door swinging out hard into the clearing, and Dex moving through the opening already low and to the right, the way men trained for entering unknown spaces move, creating angles, clearing blind spots. Reyes was right behind him. Parrish had gotten to the window on the south side and was already through it, which was an impressive piece of geometry given Parrish's size and the window's dimensions. Hammer came through the door with Marsh, and pulled left. The clearing was cold and getting dark fast, the sky having shifted from concrete gray to the specific blue-black of November dusk in the Oregon mountains, and the black truck was exactly where Parrish had said it was. North edge of the clearing, engine running, headlights cutting across the mud and the parked bikes. 3 figures, as reported, but now they had resolved from abstract threat into specific people. 2 of them moving toward the cabin's north side with something in their hands that caught the headlight glare in a way that fuel containers catch light, and one standing at the truck's hood with something that was not a fuel container. Grover saw it first. "Gun," he said, flat, informational. Hammer was already moving. He went left and kept going, using the cabin's southwest corner as cover, pulling Marsh with him, and he felt the impact of a round hitting the cabin wall above him. The specific percussion of it, the way it goes through the wood, and the sound arrives just after. And he got the corner between himself and the shooter and pressed flat against the siding and held Marsh against the wall beside him. Marsh was breathing in short, audible bursts. Not panic. The kind of breathing that happens when the body has suddenly been asked to process more adrenaline than it has efficient protocols for. He had the laptop tucked under his left arm. He had not let go of the laptop. "Don't let go of that," Hammer said. "I'm not," Marsh said. "Stay behind me. Move when I move. Stop when I stop. Do not make decisions." Understood. Marsh's voice had achieved a kind of functional steadiness that Hammer found surprising, and then on reflection, not surprising. A journalist who had spent 4 months pursuing this story had presumably been in situations that required similar recalibration. From the north side of the cabin, the sound of Dex's voice, not words, just a controlled shout that functioned as a locator, and then the sound of something large and physical happening. A collision, a grunt, the specific sound of 2 bodies meeting at speed and neither giving ground immediately. From the east, Reyes, moving toward the bikes. 2 of the charter bikes were parked on the east side, which put them between Reyes and the truck's headlights, and Hammer watched Reyes reach his bike and get low behind it and understood what Reyes was doing, putting iron between himself and the shooter at the truck hood, and in the same moment understood that the 2 men with fuel containers at the cabin's north side were the priority, because if the fire caught the structure fully, the bikes parked closest to the north wall would go with it, and without the bikes, the charter was on foot in the mountains in the dark, which was not a survivable operational position. Stitch appeared from the south side of the cabin. He had a length of firewood from the stack against the cabin's exterior. Not a weapon anyone would design, but a functional one in the hands of someone who understood leverage and impact. And he moved toward the north corner with it and disappeared around the building. The sound that followed was short and conclusive. Then Stitch's voice, controlled. "North side clear, fire surface only. They hadn't got to the structure yet. Grover's on it." Hammer exhaled. Partial win. The cabin might not be a total loss. He looked at the truck. The figure at the hood had shifted position, moved to the driver's side, using the truck's body as cover. Smarter than the other 2 had been. This one had training, or something close to it, and was using the vehicle the way you use a vehicle when you understand tactical geometry. Reyes from behind his bike. "Can't get an angle." Cole's voice, from somewhere Hammer couldn't immediately locate. "I've got the east side." "Don't," Hammer said sharply. "Not yet." And because the situation had 3 moving parts, and the third one mattered most, and the third one was the question of what Raymond Cahill himself was doing while his people were in this clearing. Cahill was not in this clearing. The gray SUV from the Forest Service road was not in this clearing, which meant either Cahill was positioned somewhere else, on the access road, at the highway junction, at the clinic in Millhaven, or Cahill was doing something operational with the time his people were buying him here. Hammer's phone was in his jacket pocket. He pulled it and hit Asante's number while keeping his shoulder flat against the cabin wall. 3 rings. 4. Voicemail. He tried again. Voicemail on the first ring this time, which meant either Asante was on another call, or his phone had been silenced deliberately, or something had happened to it. Cold moved through Hammer's chest that was not the November air. He pulled up the text chain with Dex and typed one-handed. Cahill may be at the clinic. Asante not answering. He sent it, and put the phone back in his pocket and looked at Marsh. "How fast can you publish from a phone?" he said. Marsh blinked. "The laptop. If the laptop goes down," Hammer said. "Phone." Marsh's expression processed this. "I'd need to upload the document files from the drive. The drive's in the laptop." He paused. "If I can get the files to cloud storage, 10 minutes. Maybe less." "Do it now," Hammer said. "Don't wait for me to tell you twice." Marsh opened the laptop against the cabin wall, using Hammer's body as partial cover, and his hands moved with the particular rapid efficiency of someone who has spent years working on deadlines in uncomfortable physical conditions, which Hammer reflected was perhaps the best possible preparation for the current circumstances. From the north side of the cabin, the fire sound diminishing. Grover had found the extinguisher from inside, or had used dirt, or had simply beaten it out. The how was less important than the result. The structural threat was reduced. One variable removed. From the clearing, the figure at the truck hood had not moved, was waiting, which meant either waiting for orders or waiting for backup, and both of those options were worse than aggression would have been. Dex came around the south corner of the cabin. His left sleeve was torn from the shoulder to the elbow, and there was a dark stain on it that Hammer's eyes cataloged automatically as blood before his conscious mind had completed the sentence. Dex's face showed no sign of being aware of the sleeve. "Two down on the north side," Dex said quietly. He said down the way veterans say it, which encompasses a spectrum. "Restrained. One's got a broken wrist, and the other one's going to be sleeping for a while." He looked at the truck. "The one at the vehicle is the problem." "I know," Hammer said. "He's waiting for something." "I know." Hammer looked at the truck. The engine was still running. The headlights were still on, which meant the truck's battery was live, which meant if it moved, it would move fast. "He's not waiting for his people to recover. They were expendable, and he knows it." He looked at Dex's sleeve. "How bad?" "Cosmetic," Dex said, which Hammer knew covered a wider range than cosmetic typically implied. He made a note to look at it when there was a moment to look at things. Cole's voice, still from the east, still with that quality of high-order attention that Hammer had come to depend on. "He's on a phone." The figure at the truck hood. On a phone. Hammer felt the pieces assemble. "He's calling in the clinic location," Hammer said. He was moving before he finished the sentence, coming around the south corner and into the clearing's east side, keeping low, using the bike cluster as cover. And he heard Dex say something behind him that was probably objection-shaped, but he was already past the range where it was actionable. He got to Reyes's position behind the bike cluster and crouched there and looked across the 30 feet of clearing at the truck and the figure at its hood. The figure was turned slightly away, the phone up, and in the truck's cab lights Hammer could now see his face. He was not Raymond Cahill. He was younger than Cahill, late 30s possibly, with the kind of physical bearing that said private security or former law enforcement rather than contractor. And he had the practiced stillness of someone who had assessed the situation and decided that the situation was contained enough to make a call. He was wrong about that. "Hey," Hammer said. The figure turned, phone still to his ear, eyes finding Hammer across the hood in the half-dark. "Tell him it's over," Hammer said. His voice was very flat. "Tell him wherever he's going, we already called ahead." Which was not entirely true, but the thing about a bluff is that it doesn't need to be true to be effective. It needs to arrive with sufficient conviction at sufficient speed that the target's decision-making process is disrupted before it can fully evaluate the claim. The figure's eyes moved. Phone still at his ear. A calculation happening behind the stillness. Hammer's own phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't look at it. "Put the phone down," Hammer said. The figure at the truck made a decision, and the decision was the wrong one. He went for the truck door rather than standing his ground, the door swinging open, which meant he was going to get in the truck and move. And a moving truck in a confined clearing with bikes and men in it was a threat category of its own. Reyes was already moving. He came off the ground from behind the bike in a single motion and crossed the 15 feet to the truck's passenger side before the driver had the door fully open, and he hit the door from the outside, slamming it back against its hinges, and the figure caught the edge of it in the shoulder and went sideways against the cab, and Reyes had one arm over the top of the door and the other around the figure's collar before the recovery was possible. The phone dropped into the mud. Hammer walked to it, picked it up, looked at the screen. The call was still connected. The timer running, 15 seconds, 20. He put the phone to his ear, silence on the line, the specific silence of someone who is listening. Cahill, Hammer said. A pause. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then a voice, not what Hammer had expected, not aggressive, not urgent, measured. The voice of a man who had been in positions of controlled authority for so long that the register had become the voice, indistinguishable from the personality. Malone, Raymond Cahill said. I wondered when you'd turn up. We have the drive, Hammer said. We have the documents. We have the journalist, and the journalist's editor is standing by. He paused. You have about 8 minutes before this is public and you lose every lever you have. A longer pause. You don't want to do that, Cahill said. I'm doing it, Hammer said. There are classification implications. Don't, Hammer said. The word came out quieter than he'd intended, which made it land harder. Don't tell me about classification. You used classification as a filing cabinet for evidence of what you did to those soldiers, to Diane Wexler. He stopped, started again. I was in that aid station. I was there for all of it. His voice was steady. He was making a specific effort to keep it steady. You don't get to tell me about classification. The line was quiet for a moment. Where are you? Hammer said. Nothing. You're at the clinic, Hammer said. Or you're on the way there, because you figured out that the woman and the child are the evidence that can identify you directly, and the documents are secondary. If you have them, you have leverage. If you have the child, he stopped. Cahill, listen to what I'm about to say. His voice had gone to a place below the flat steadiness, a place he hadn't been in a long time. If you go near that clinic, you will not complete whatever you have planned. I promise you that with everything I have. He paused. And I have a great deal more than you think I do. The line went dead. Hammer looked at the phone. Then he looked at his own phone, which he'd ignored through the last 2 minutes, and the screen showed 4 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize and 1 text from a 503 area code that said, "This is Asante." Using front desk phone. Man outside clinic, gray SUV. I have the door locked. Girl is with me. Please. The timestamp on the text was 9 minutes ago. He turned to the clearing. Bikes, he said. Now. The speed at which the charter mobilized in the next 90 seconds was the product of 15 years of riding together and the specific efficiency that develops in groups of men who have learned to move as a unit under conditions where deliberation is a luxury. Grover had the sedan running before Hammer reached his bike. Dex was already astride, engine over, the torn sleeve dark in the headlight wash. Reyes had cable-tied the man from the truck to the truck's door handle with the kind of zip tie that every Cascade charter member carried as a standard kit item along with the trauma supplies, and he jogged to his bike and was on it in one motion. Stitch looked at Hammer from across the clearing. "The 2 on the north side," he said. Hammer looked at him. "They're restrained," Stitch said. "They're alive. We can't leave them here indefinitely." "Parish stays," Hammer said. "Parish calls county sheriff in 30 minutes. Enough time to get clear, enough time to make sure they're not out here all night." He looked at Parish. Parish nodded once. He'd done harder things than babysitting 2 restrained men in a burned-smelling cabin, and his expression communicated that he understood this and was at peace with it. "Marsh goes with Grover," Hammer said. "In the car. If anything happens to the bikes on this road, the laptop needs to get through." Marsh, who was standing at the cabin door with the laptop against his chest and the expression of a man who has spent the last 20 minutes discovering exactly how serious the situation he'd been investigating actually was, nodded with the emphatic quality of someone who is very grateful to be told where to go. They hit the gravel track at a pace that the track was not designed for, and Hammer didn't care. 6 bikes and the sedan moving through the dark trees at the limit of what the headlights permitted, the branches close on both sides, the cold air hitting Hammer's face at speed, and the engine sound enormous in the enclosed channel of the track, filling everything, the way it always did, the way it had always been the one reliable method of clearing the space behind his eyes when the space needed clearing. He didn't clear it this time. He let everything stay exactly where it was. The anger and the 8 years and Diane Wexler's name and Sophie's hand on top of his in the clinic hallway and the flicker of the fluorescent light and the chemical smell from the cabin wall and Cahill's measured, undisturbed voice on the phone. He let all of it stay because he needed it, because what was in the clinic at the end of this road required exactly the thing that had been building in him since 2011 and had never found a direction until today. They hit the highway at speed. Dex pulled up beside him and looked across, and Hammer gave him the signal. Fast, together, no stops. And Dex nodded and pulled to the head of the column and held a pace that was 20 over the limit and steady. Millhaven was 23 minutes at normal speed. They covered it in 6 ton. The clinic's parking area was lit by 2 overhead lights, and the gray SUV was there. Parked at the far end, away from the lights, the nose pointed at the building, engine off. Not a man in a hurry. A man who had arrived, assessed the situation, and decided that patience was the correct operational posture, which meant Cahill had not yet gone inside, which meant the locked door was still doing its job and Asante was still behind it, which meant they were not too late, which was the only fact that mattered. Hammer pulled into the lot and killed his engine, and the rest of the column pulled in behind him, the sound of the bikes dropping to silence one by one, and in the abrupt quiet, the only sounds were the wind in the parking lot oaks and the faint traffic on Millhaven's Main Street 2 blocks east and the ticking of cooling engines. The gray SUV sat at the far end of the lot. Nothing moved. Hammer got off his bike and walked toward it. He walked steadily, at a normal pace, not because he was unafraid, but because the space between afraid and moving had collapsed into something he didn't have a word for. Behind him he heard the crunch of boots on asphalt as Dex and the others followed, and the sound of that, 6 men behind him, moving together, leather and steel, and the particular weight of men who have made their choice and are done negotiating it, was a sound that did something to the air in the parking lot that Hammer felt rather than heard. He stopped 10 feet from the SUV. The driver's door opened. Raymond Cahill was not what Hammer had imagined him to be over 8 years of not quite letting himself imagine. He was tall, lean, with gray hair kept short in the way of men who came up through institutions that valued that particular aesthetic. He was wearing a dark coat, good quality, and he stood beside the open door of the SUV with his hands at his sides and looked at Hammer across the parking lot with the expression of a man who had prepared for this and was reassessing the quality of his preparation. He looked at the 6 men behind Hammer. He looked at the clinic building. He looked at Hammer. "You rode fast," he said. "Yes," Hammer said. "I didn't expect the full club." "I know," Hammer said. "You expected me alone. You expected to negotiate. You thought this was personal, and you could resolve a personal situation with a personal conversation." He paused. "It is personal, but it stopped being only mine about 4 hours ago." Cahill's eyes moved across the men behind Hammer again. The calculation in them was visible. The kind of rapid arithmetic that a man who has spent a career managing situations through money and leverage performs when he finds himself in a situation where those tools are not available. "The documents," Cahill said. "Are being uploaded right now," Hammer said. "From the sedan that pulled in behind us. Marsh is in the car. He's been transmitting since we left the cabin." Cahill looked at the sedan. Grover was parked near the entrance, engine still running, the interior dark. "If that publishes," Cahill began. "It publishes," Hammer said. "That's already done. I'm not here to negotiate the publication." He took 1 step forward. "I'm here for the woman and the child in that building." Another step. "And I'm here to tell you, in person, from me to you, with the people who've decided to stand behind me to confirm it, that you are finished." Cahill was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man who has not often been told things he couldn't address through the mechanisms he'd spent his career building, and who was processing the specific texture of a moment in which those mechanisms are absent. "Malone," he said. "The investigation in 2011. I want you to understand." "I understand everything," Hammer said. "I've understood it for 8 years. I just didn't have the words for it." He stopped. "Diane Wexler was 22 years old. She was from Medford. She should have survived what happened to her, and she didn't Because the supplies weren't there, and the supplies weren't there because you were stealing from the contract that paid for them. He said it without raising his voice. He said it the way you say things that you have rehearsed in the private dark for a very long time and are now saying for the first and last time out loud to the person who needed to hear them. I don't need you to explain it. I need you to be here when the people with the authority to make it matter arrive. He pulled his own phone. He pressed call on the number with the 202 area code. It picked up on the first ring. He's in the Millhaven Free Clinic parking lot, Hammer said. Gray SUV. I have 6 witnesses and a journalist with full documentation. He paused. Yes. Now. He ended the call and looked at Cahill. Federal investigators. The ones your associate has been slowing down. My contact has been running a parallel track for the last several hours. She found a lane around the obstruction. He paused. It took finding the right documentation, which is, as of about 3 minutes ago, publicly available. Cahill's face did something that Hammer watched carefully, because it was the specific thing that happens to a man's face when the variables that have kept him functional for a decade stop being variables and become facts. It happened quickly, and then it stopped happening, replaced by the stillness. But Hammer had been watching for it, and he saw it clearly. The clinic's front door opened. Asante came out first, blinking in the parking lot lights, and behind him Sophie, wearing Asante's clinic coat over her nightgown because it was cold, and Sophie looked at the parking lot full of motorcycles and men in leather vests, and one man in a dark coat standing at a gray SUV, and her face did its processing, that rapid two-adult calculation that had been breaking Hammer's heart since the highway. And then her eyes found him, and the calculation stopped. She crossed the parking lot to him. She walked straight past Cahill without looking at him, which was either complete indifference or the most devastating kind of judgment, and she stopped in front of Hammer and looked up at him. You said you'd come back, she said. I said I'd come back, he said. She nodded once. Then she reached up and took his hand in both of hers, the same grip she'd had in the clinic hallway, both palms around his, and she held it with the specific seriousness of a child who has decided something and is expressing the decision through contact rather than words. Hammer stood in the cold parking lot with Sophie's hands around his and the evidence of 10 years of institutional murder uploaded to every server Callum Marsh's publication had access to, and Raymond Cahill standing 12 feet away running out of options one by one, and the 6 men behind him who had ridden 16 minutes of dark highway without being asked twice, and the sound of Dex's voice behind him saying quietly into his own phone, "We're going to need county and federal presence at the Millhaven Free Clinic, Millhaven, Oregon, as soon as you can get someone here," and the cold November air and the ticking engines and the parking lot lights making everything flat and clear. Somewhere 2 blocks east, a car alarm went off briefly and stopped. Somewhere further, a dog. The night held everything in it. The fire smell still on Hammer's jacket, the weight of what was coming, the specific shape of what had just happened and was still happening. And in the middle of all of it, in the particular stillness between the last thing and the next thing, Hammer Malone stood with a small girl's hands holding his and felt, for the first time in 8 years, that the weight he'd been carrying had found somewhere to put itself down. Not gone, not resolved, but placed. And then blue and red light swept across the clinic's white exterior wall from the direction of Millhaven's main street, and the first siren became audible, and Raymond Cahill looked at the lights and looked at Hammer and opened his mouth to say something, and Hammer looked back at him with the specific expression of a man who has already heard everything the other man could possibly say and has decided that none of it changes anything, and waited. The first county unit arrived 4 minutes after the siren became audible, and then a second, and then a third, and the Millhaven Free Clinic parking lot became the kind of organized chaos that law enforcement produces when multiple agencies arrive simultaneously at a scene nobody fully briefed them on. Radios overlapping, flashlight beams crossing, voices asking the same questions from different angles. Raymond Cahill did not run. Hammer had half expected him to make some kind of last calculation. The SUV was behind him. The lot had 2 exits. But Cahill stood beside his open door with his hands visible and his expression arranged in the specific composure of a man who has decided that the only remaining asset he has is the appearance of cooperation, and who is already thinking about lawyers rather than escape routes. It was, Hammer reflected, the posture of someone who had spent a career inside institutions and believed, even now, that institutions were navigable if you spoke the right language. He would find out how well that belief held. A federal agent arrived 22 minutes after the county units, driving a dark sedan, showing credentials to the county officers at the lot entrance with the brisk authority of someone who has been briefed en route and arrived with a clear sense of jurisdiction. She was a woman in her mid-40s with short hair and the particular kind of unhurried movement that communicates absolute certainty about where she is supposed to be and what she is supposed to do when she gets there. She spoke briefly to the county officers and then crossed the lot toward Cahill, and Hammer watched the moment Cahill's composure registered who she was. Something shifted in his jaw, a microcontraction, barely visible. And Hammer understood that Cahill recognized her, and that the recognition was not welcome. Hammer's contact in Washington had done what she'd said she would. She'd found the lane around the obstruction. Whatever case was now standing in this parking lot had legs that Cahill's associate could not reach. Hammer stood at the clinic entrance with Sophie still holding his hand and watched it happen. The handcuffs, the formal language, the specific way Cahill's shoulders changed geometry as his hands were taken behind him, the way a man who has controlled rooms for 30 years looks when the room is no longer his. It was not satisfying in the way that satisfaction is usually described. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of a door closing that should have closed 8 years ago, the sound of it reaching him now after the long delay, and the delay itself being part of the wait. A county detective came to take statements. Hammer gave his clearly and completely, including the details of the cabin, the fire, the men restrained on the north side where Parrish was waiting, the financial documentation, the drive, Callum Marsh's publication, and the name Diane Wexler, which he gave specifically and deliberately because he wanted it in the official record in connection with Raymond Cahill's name for the first time since the after-action review had made its quiet, toothless finding. The detective wrote it down. All of it. Without editorial comment, which was what Hammer needed from him. Dex gave a statement. Reyes, Grover. Each of them precise, factual, offering exactly what they'd witnessed without embellishment. The way men trained in military reporting give statements. Information as information, nothing performed. Vic Strand, who had driven his bike to Millhaven separately and arrived during the federal agent's conversation with Cahill, stood at the edge of the lot with his arms crossed and his pale eyes moving across the scene. And when the detective reached him, Vic gave a statement that was brief and complete and ended with, Daniel Strand, my brother, former Army Supply Convoy, Kandahar, 2009 and 2010, 3 TBIs. You should write that name down too. The detective wrote it down. Vic watched him do it, and when the detective looked up, Vic nodded once and stepped back. Callum Marsh had published at 6:47 p.m. The story was live. Hammer knew this because Marsh came out of the sedan at some point during the statement giving and crossed the lot with his laptop open like he was reading from it while he walked, which was either journalistic habit or genuine inability to put it down. And he stopped near Hammer and turned the screen and said, 14,000 views in the first hour. My editor is fielding calls from 3 national outlets. He paused. It's going to be very loud by morning. Good, Hammer said. Marsh looked at him. He had the expression of a man who wants to say something that is larger than the moment permits. He settled for, I'll make sure the record shows what the charter did tonight. All of it. Make sure the record shows what Greta Mueller did, Hammer said. She found it. She ran with her daughter. She held on to it for 3 weeks while someone was trying to kill her. He paused. That's the story. Marsh looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded and went back to his phone. Greta came downstairs from the clinic's upper room at 8 o'clock, moving carefully, one hand on the stair rail, and Asante was behind her with the specific hovering attention of a doctor accompanying a patient who has been told to rest and has declined to rest. She came through the clinic door and stopped on the front step and looked at the parking lot, the remaining county unit, the dark sedan, the cluster of motorcycles, the men in leather standing in the cold. And then she looked at Sophie, who was sitting on the clinic step with Boots beside her. Boots's large frame curled somehow into a configuration that fit the small space next to her without making her feel crowded, the two of them looking at something on Boots's phone that was apparently compelling enough to hold Sophie's attention despite the fact that her entire world had spent the last 12 hours being dismantled and reconstructed. Sophie looked up and saw her mother and was on her feet and across the 3 steps between them before Greta had finished exhaling. Greta caught her, both arms around her despite the cracked ribs, and the sound she made when Sophie's weight came into her was not quite pain and not quite relief, but the specific thing that lives between them, and she pressed her face into Sophie's hair and stayed there. And Hammer looked away because some things are not for observers. When he looked back, Greta was looking at him over Sophie's head. Her gray eyes in the parking lot light, the new sutures on her forearm, the compression wrap visible at the hem of her jacket because Asante's jacket didn't fully cover it. He walked to the step. "It's done?" she said. "It started," he said, because done was not the right word. The investigations would take months, the legal proceedings longer. The full unraveling of a decade-long financial architecture was not a single night's work, but the thing that could be done in a single night had been done. Cahill is in custody. The documents are public. The federal investigators have physical evidence and a clear chain of custody and enough public visibility now that they can't slow walk it. She absorbed this. Sophie was still pressed against her, both arms around her mother's waist. "My career," Greta said. Not a question. Not grief, exactly. The practical acknowledgement of someone who has been running from a fire for 3 weeks and is now standing in the ash looking at what's left. "You're a whistleblower with documentation," Hammer said. "In 12 hours, you'll have lawyers from 3 organizations calling to offer representation. In 24 hours, Cascade Regional's board will be in emergency session, and the first thing they'll want is someone on their side who understood what was happening before anyone else did." He paused. "Your career is the one thing in this that isn't damaged." She looked at him. "You sound very certain." "I'm certain about the things I'm certain about," he said. "The rest, I'm less reliable on." Something moved through her face that was closer to the smile than anything he'd seen from her since the cabin floor. "That's a very honest thing to say," she said. "I'm working on that," he said. They stood on the Klanick step in the cold for a moment, the two of them, with Sophie's warmth between them and the parking lot, and the remaining official vehicles, and the idling motorcycles, and the November dark all around. And it was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one, which Hammer had come to believe was more valuable than comfort in most situations. "Thank you," Greta said. She said it quietly, directly, without the prefatory language that people sometimes use to build toward gratitude when the gratitude itself feels too large to hand over directly. She just said it. "Sophie stopped us," Hammer said. "She's the one you should be talking to." Sophie, without lifting her face from her mother's jacket. "I heard that." "Good," Hammer said. The diner was called Millhaven Family Restaurant, which was the kind of name that required no creative investment and delivered exactly what it promised. A long counter with round stools, 6 booths with red vinyl seats repaired in 2 places with electrical tape, a coffee machine that had been running continuously since approximately 1987, and an overnight cook named Harold, who wore the same expression whether he was making eggs at 3 in the morning or hearing that 12 people in leather vests wanted the full menu. They arrived at 11:30. The clinic had cleared, the county units had gone. Asante had agreed to let Greta and Sophie leave with the charter under strict instructions about the ribs and the concussion, and a follow-up appointment he had written on a prescription pad and pressed into Greta's hand with the specific emphasis of a man who knows instructions will be ignored, but is committed to the record. Marsh had gone with a federal agent to give a longer formal statement, which he had apparently been looking forward to in the way that journalists look forward to things that will become paragraphs later. Parrish had been picked up from the cabin after county deputies processed the scene, the 2 restrained men having been collected with the particular mix of embarrassment and relief that men in their situation tend to exhibit. 12 people in the diner. The full contingent of the Cascade Charter's operating members who had been present that day, plus Greta and Sophie and Callum Marsh, who arrived 40 minutes after everyone else and slid into the end of the last booth without ceremony. Harold poured coffee without being asked, which was the correct instinct and well executed. The first 20 minutes were mostly quiet. Not the loaded silences of the cabin or the parking lot. A different quality of quiet, the quiet of people who have been at a sustained physical and emotional pitch for many hours and have arrived at the specific valley on the other side of that peak where the body simply stops producing the hormones that make urgency feel urgent. Coffee cups moved. Someone ordered toast. Someone else asked for eggs. Sophie sat in the booth between Greta and Boots and ate pancakes with the focused seriousness of a child who has been running on terror and adrenaline since morning and has finally permitted her body to register that it is hungry. Vic Strand was at the counter. He'd taken a stool at the far end, slightly apart from the others, not from hostility. The hostility had left him somewhere between the cabin and the parking lot, Hammer thought, or perhaps somewhere between the detective's notepad and the mention of his brother's name entering the official record. He was separate the way he sometimes was after the difficult things, processing in the particular internal way that Vic processed, which required physical proximity to the group and spatial distance from conversation. Hammer took his coffee and sat on the stool beside him. Vic didn't look up from his mug. "You could have told us about the Wexler thing," he said. "Before today?" "I know," Hammer said. "We would have—" Vic stopped, reconsidered. "I don't know what we would have done, but we would have known." "I didn't know what to do with it myself," Hammer said. "I spent 8 years not knowing what to do with it. You can't hand something to other people that you can't carry yourself." Vic was quiet for a moment. He turned his mug in a slow circle on the counter, the ceramic scraping slightly. "Daniel's going to want to know about this," he said, "about the financial records, about what those supply contracts actually were." He paused. "It won't change his TB-IS. It won't give him his left side vision back." Another pause. "But he's been told for 6 years that it was circumstance, just bad luck, just the fog of war." He looked at his mug. Knowing it was a choice someone made, knowing there's a name and a number in a transaction, that's different. "It's different," Hammer agreed. "I don't know if it's better," Vic said. "No," Hammer said. "Me neither. But it's true. And true is the thing you can actually do something with, even if what you do with it is just carry it more accurately." Vic looked at him. A long look, the kind that covers a lot of ground in not many seconds. Then he picked up his coffee and drank from it. "You should eat something," he said. "You look like 6 hours of a bad road." "That's accurate," Hammer said. He ordered eggs. He ate them. Around 1 in the morning, Sophie fell asleep in the booth with her head on Greta's arm, and the diner had settled into the specific register of a place that has absorbed a large group and metabolized them into its natural rhythm. Harold moving behind the counter with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has worked overnight shifts long enough that the night has lost its separateness from the day. The coffee machine cycling, the occasional headlights on the street outside sweeping briefly across the front windows. Dex sat across from Hammer in the last booth and held his mug in both hands and looked at the table. His sleeve had been cleaned and wrapped. Stitch had handled it in the clinic parking lot with the matter-of-fact competence of someone for whom field dressing is a language they speak better than most. And the wound was, as Dex had said, largely cosmetic. A deep graze, the kind of thing that would be a significant scar, and a story eventually. "The memorial ride," Dex said. Hammer looked at him. "We didn't finish it," Dex said. "Not accusatory, just naming a fact." "No," Hammer said. "The men we were riding for," Dex said. He paused. "I keep thinking about whether they'd consider today a detour, or whether they'd consider today the point." Hammer thought about this for a moment. He thought about the specific men the ride honored, their names, their faces, the particular textures of who they'd been before and during, and what they'd become in the various ways that soldiers become things they didn't start out as. He thought about what they'd been trained for and what they'd been asked to do, and the gap between those two things, and how that gap was where most of the damage lived. "I think they'd consider it the same road," he said. "Different mile marker." Dex nodded slowly. He turned his mug. "We'll finish it," he said. "Next week, maybe. Run the full route." He paused. "Sophie should ride." Hammer looked at him. "On Boots' bike?" Dex said. "Passenger, if Greta says yes." He said it simply, the way Dex said things that mattered, without ornamentation, without signaling that they mattered, simply placing the idea on the table and letting it sit there. She stopped 40 bikes. She should know what it feels like to ride with them. Hammer looked across the diner to the booth where Sophie was sleeping against her mother's arm. Greta was awake, her own coffee in her free hand, her eyes half closed, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone who is learning, in real time, what it feels like for the sustained emergency to stop being an emergency. It was a specific adjustment. Hammer knew it from his own experience. The way the body, having been at threat level for an extended period, doesn't immediately understand that it's been given permission to stop. He looked back at Dex. "She'll say yes," he said. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, the Cascade Charter ran a memorial route through the Oregon high country that took them past the gravel track that led to a burned-out cabin they didn't stop at, and through Mill Haven without stopping, and out the other side into the mountain roads that ran north and east through the tall timber until the trees opened up and the sky became the wide, pale blue of late November after the clouds have cleared, the kind of sky that goes all the way up and doesn't apologize for its depth. Sophie rode with Boots. She sat in front of him on the wide seat, both hands on the tank, his arms bracketing her without confining her, and she wore a small helmet that Boots had ordered online and a vest that had been made for her. The members of the Cascade Charter had apparently discussed this among themselves without telling Hammer until it was done, a small leather vest with her name on the back in the same script as the Charter's patches, and Sophie in an arc above an Oregon mountain outline that Stitch had sketched freehand and a leatherworker in Portland had executed with the kind of care that goes into things made for specific people. She'd looked at it for a long time when they gave it to her. She'd looked at it the way children look at things they don't yet have the adult vocabulary for, absorbing it through some other mechanism. Then she'd put it on and looked down at herself and said, with the gravity of a child making an announcement, "Okay." That was all. Just, "Okay," which covered everything. Greta rode in the sedan with Grover because the ribs were still in their compression wrap, and the Cascade Charter had apparently decided among themselves that the new protocol included Grover's sedan as a permanent addition to the column for situations requiring it, which was another thing Hammer had learned about rather than been consulted about, and had chosen to be grateful for rather than comment on. She rode with the window down despite the cold. Hammer knew this because he could see her from his position 3 bikes ahead, the sedan's front window a dark rectangle in his mirror, and then, when he looked more directly, a pale rectangle with her face in it and her hair moving in the cold air. She caught him looking and didn't look away. He didn't either. Then the road curved and his mirror showed him only road. They stopped at a pullout above the valley, the way they always stopped, the way the memorial ride had always stopped at this specific point where the timber broke and you could see south and east for 30 miles on a clear day. And on this day it was clear, genuinely clear, the kind of rare November clarity that comes after a week of rain and feels like compensation. The engines went off, one by one. 40 bikes and one sedan. The silence that follows 40 engines is its own kind of sound, not absence, but presence. The presence of everything the engines had been covering, which was wind and distance and the specific acoustics of a high place on a clear day. Hammer stood at the pullout's edge with his helmet in his hand and looked south for a while. He said the names in his head, the way he always said them here, the men the ride was for, in the order he'd known them, starting with the ones he'd known longest. He added Diane Wexler's name at the end, the way you add something that has always belonged in a list and has finally been returned to it. He heard small boots on gravel beside him. Sophie stood at the pullout's edge next to him, her vest slightly too large across the shoulders, her hair coming out from under the small helmet that she'd pushed up on her forehead. She looked south with the same focused attention she brought to everything, as if the view were a problem she was working on. "It's far," she said. "Yes," he said. "Can you see all the way to Portland?" "Not quite." "But close?" "Close enough," he said. She stood there for a moment. The wind off the valley moved her hair. Below them, somewhere in the tree line, a bird called once and stopped. "My mom says we're going home next week," Sophie said. "I know," he said. Greta had told him, Portland, her apartment, her hospital, a different hospital, a position that had been offered with the specific speed of institutions attempting to correct for the behavior of other institutions. A fresh start in the practical sense. The other kind of fresh start was slower and didn't announce itself. "Are you going to visit?" Sophie said. She said it in the direct, unguarded way that children ask the questions adults approach sideways. He looked at her. She was looking at the view, not at him, but her hands were still at her sides in the attentive posture of someone waiting for a real answer. "Yes," he said. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. She reached over and put her hand in his, not all the fingers, just the small grip of 2 fingers wrapped around his index finger, the way very young children hold on when they're standing somewhere high and wide and want to be anchored without appearing to need anchoring. He stood with that grip around his finger, and the view and the wind and the silence of 40 engines not running, and behind him the sound of the men moving quietly. Boots, the low registers of voices that didn't need to carry, the scratch of a lighter, the sound of Vic Strand saying something to Reyes in a tone that was almost but not quite warm, which for Vic was close enough. Dex came to stand on his other side, just stood there, didn't say anything. Dex had a gift for presence that didn't require speech, and he exercised it now with the ease of long practice. The 3 of them stood at the edge of the pullout, a large man in a leather vest and a small girl with a borrowed grip on his finger, and another large man who didn't say anything because nothing needed saying. And the view went south for 30 miles, and the November sky was as blue as it was going to get. And the cold was the clean kind, the kind that doesn't apologize, the kind that simply is. Hammer thought about the highway. 40 bikes and a gray sky and a small figure in a nightgown lying down in the road, choosing the only leverage available to her, her own small body, placed in the path of something large and trusting that it would stop. He thought about the specific courage of that, which he had not stopped thinking about since the moment he'd seen her, and which he suspected he would not stop thinking about for a long time. He thought about Greta in the sedan below them, window open, cold air through her hair, learning how to let the emergency be over. He thought about Vic's brother Daniel and the official record that now contained his name in connection with something that could be documented and proven and placed in front of people with the authority to make it matter, which was not everything, which was not close to everything, but was the thing that was actually available and was therefore the thing that had to count. He thought about the after-action review in the small room at Fort Lewis and the civilian lawyer who had told him he was free to go. He thought about how long it had taken him to understand that free to go and free were not the same thing, and how the difference between them had been the 8 years he'd spent going, and how this stretch of Oregon highway on this November Saturday was as close as he'd gotten to understanding where going actually ended. He didn't have a name for what came after going. He suspected it didn't have a name yet. He suspected it was the kind of thing that only got named once you'd been in it long enough to describe it from the inside, and he was only just arriving. Sophie's 2-finger grip tightened slightly, not pulling him anywhere, just holding on. The wind moved through the valley below, bending the tops of the fir trees in a slow wave that traveled south until it was too far to see, and the engine stayed quiet, and the sky stayed blue. And Hammer Malone stood at the edge of a high place on a clear day and let the distance be what it was, not empty, not finished, but open, which was a different thing, and which for the first time in 8 years felt less like exposure and more like possibility. Behind him, someone's boot scraped gravel. A quiet laugh from one of the men. Short, real, the kind that happens without planning. The smell of coffee from someone's thermos carried on the cold air. Leather and engine oil and pine resin, and the particular human warmth of people standing close together in an open place. The Cascade Charter stood on the high road above the valley and looked south, and said nothing. And that nothing held everything they needed it to hold. And after a while Dex turned first, the way Dex always turned first, and the sound of boots returning to bikes moved through the group, and engines started one by one, low and steady. The sound building from 1 voice to 40 until the pullout was full of that particular music, the music of departure and continuation, and then the column moved and the road ran north and the sky went with them.